you ever wondered what the best project setup is for a production data pipeline? In this video, we will walk through the project setup that will enable your business to get access to the data they need the fastest, while also keeping the necessary data protections in place. Our recommended setup will likely be the easiest to manage as your business grows. For illustrative purposes, we have expanded components of the aviation reference project into multiple projects. Now let's get started.
In order to follow along this video, you will need to have the permission to create projects. This is a permission typically included in the editor and owner roles, which you can check in the platform settings shown here. And these editor and owner roles must be granted in the namespace settings shown here. If you don't have access to the roles or namespace settings, you should ask your Foundry administrator about getting permissions to create projects. Assuming that you have the permissions to create a project, let's discuss the anatomy of a pipeline that can support a more modular permissioning setup. A key part of designing a data foundation is deciding which projects need to be created for your production data pipeline in order to enable future expansion and easy permission management. The typical pipeline stages include data flowing through 4 projects that have distinct purposes. First, there is a data source project, where ingested data will land and be cleaned. Second, there is a transform project, where data will be joined to produce reusable datasets. Third, there is an ontology project, where data will be used to create discrete business objects. And fourth, there is a workflow project, where the business assets live. In our case, this is an operational flight alert inbox application. These different projects help delineate responsibilities between teams, and they provide meaningful and manageable boundaries for permissions. As an example, let's create one of these projects from scratch, so we can see the steps we took to build this pipeline. We'll create only the transform project in our example. Returning to the projects page, we can click on the green New button and pick Project. Depending on your Foundry instance, you might see different dialogues for creating a project. To start, we can input a project name, a description, and pick a namespace. As a reminder, a namespace is a security primitive that allows an administrator to define common settings across a group of projects. In our example, we will pick the Sky Industries namespace. We will then restrict access to only the Sky Industries organization. Lastly, we'll set the default role to Discoverer, so that all users in the Sky Industries organization can discover the project and the existence of the resources inside the project. If a user is interested in data access, they can then request access to the project. Once we've completed the dialog, we can then click Create. After creating the project, we will want to make it easy to manage different levels of access to the project going forward. To do that, we recommend creating a group for each role, except for the default role. Managing permissions via group membership will make it easier to onboard and offboard colleagues. In our example, we will create 3 groups, one for owner, one for editor, and one for viewer. We can do this in the platform settings interface as shown. After we've created the necessary groups, we can go ahead and grant each of these groups their corresponding roles in the project. Also, in each project, we'll create a code repository, which is where our transformations will live. Now that we have a project to build our pipeline in, we can start using Foundry to author our business logic. For details on best practices, review the code repository videos my colleagues made. Before we can use data from another project, we need to create a reference to it in our current project. Once we do so, we can use that data set in our builds and enable anyone in our project to author transformations on that data. In our example, we can see what it looks like when we add a project reference to the flights dataset in the data source project to our transform project. That completes our example of creating the transform project from scratch. Let's now return to our completed pipeline. If we toggle the data lineage legend to project, we can see how all the data flows between the projects in our pipeline. The benefit of having our pipeline split up into 4 projects is that we can give users specific role access separately for each project while also keeping project access uniform. For example, we will add our first business user, Eric Yates, to the Aviation Ontology Viewer group, which will give him viewer access to the Aviation Ontology project. Switching the data lineage legend to permission mode, we can see that Eric now has viewable access on the ontology datasets, which are the blue nodes. Given all the project defaults are set to Discoverer, Eric only has discoverable access on the data source and transform projects, which are purple nodes. Note that having Discoverer access on the data source project and transform project will not preclude users from being granted access to downstream data. Let's switch to another more complex example. Let's say Eric's colleague, Linda, is someone who needs to own and maintain their production pipelines that generate the ontology data, but she does not need to have the ability to manage permissions on the ontology data herself. To support this setup, we would add Linda to the owner groups on the data source and transform projects, and to the editor group on the ontology project. Switching our permission mode to View As Linda, we can see that datasets Linda is now the owner and editor of across the project boundaries. In conclusion, taking the time to deliberately think through how you want to structure your projects is important to allow your work to scale faster. And managing permissions via group membership makes it easier to onboard and offboard colleagues with different roles across your organization.